isn't art, but I think it is. And all art is about noticing what's going on in the world and making a record of the way that you respond to having noticed things. And hopefully making a record, whether it's a record or a painting or a novel or whatever it was, making a record of your response and your emotions about something that you've noticed that other people can understand.
Perhaps one of the most brilliant yet tenebrous musical artists of our time is Roger Waters, the bassist and leader of British supergroup Pink Floyd. In his 18-year career with the band, he's been responsible for writing some of the darkest, most obscure, but popular music in the history of rock and roll. The Floyd's album, Dark Side of the Moon, which dealt with stress, lunacy, and death in our modern society, is in the Guinness Book of Records for being on the Billboard Top LP charts longer than any other. In May of this year, it passed its 10th anniversary, 520 weeks in the charts. But it looks as though the era of Pink Floyd may be over. Earlier this year, guitarist David Gilmour released his second solo album, following it up with his own tour. And the recent release of Roger Waters' first solo effort, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, seems to spell an end for the group.
An angel on a horn pulls across to greet a fellow rolling stone. Puts his back up on his stand, leans back and then extends a scar, breathes a hand. He said, how you doing, bro? Where you been? Where you going? Your hand in some strange California when she breaks the bone.
Reluctant as he is to tour, following several past moments when Floyd fans got out of hand, Waters is out on the road to support this new album. For the most part, things have been going well, but there have been exceptions.
Well, the very first gig that we did here, which was the first night, we did 2 nights in Connecticut and Hartford, and the first night, there were a couple of cherry bombs, and they were shouting and screaming through everything, and I stood there on stage, and I thought, Jesus Christ, what have I done, you know?
Here it is all back in my face again.
Can't handle 2 or 3 weeks of this. And I got really, really depressed. So the next day I went straight to the radio station and harangued them for about an hour about, you know, how difficult it is actually to perform under those circumstances. If they're clearly not listening to you because they're whistling, so if they're performing as well, then you have to go into a Class B show where you accept that that's not going to happen, and you put up the wall and perform behind it. And then and just concentrate technically on trying to do what you do as well as you can. But you never get those sparkly magic moments that sometimes occur at live.
If you're a person who's always believed in communication between the band and the audience, how did a situation like Montreal in 1977, where 110,000 people went out of control on you, ever happen?
Greed, you know, and ego. I think greed and ego are responsible for most stadium gigs. Oh, we can sell 90,000 tickets, or, you know. And then the little man comes rushing into the dressing room and said, have you seen how much we grossed? And everybody gets excited. And after a bit, you realize that that's all they're about, really.
Montreal, with all those people just not listening, that was the final straw?
Yeah, well, that whole tour was a real drag, those stadium gigs. That's the only tour we ever did where we did lots of big stadiums. And I really hated it. I hated it. And Montreal was the final straw. I mean, it's a famous story now that I actually was, you know, I ended up spitting at some guy who was in the front row there, and I thought, Jesus Christ, have I been brought to this? And so I vowed I'd never do anything again.
The next Pink Floyd work didn't come until 2 years after that date. In the ensuing time, Roger Waters had become Pink Floyd and put The Wall into the #1 spot for 26 weeks. The Wall was Waters' most personal Floyd album, and indeed was in part an autobiography.
Well, a lot of the early stuff is, you know, it's just a straight autobiography. All that, you know, dying rat business and things like that. And putting stuff on railway lines and things. That was all stuff I just dredged up from my childhood. And a lot of the feelings, you know, about being in an empty house and, you know, the father's uniform and all that stuff. But later on it gets, later on it's a story that I make up about rock and roll, really, from what I've observed more of other people. I mean, I've never smashed up a hotel room in my life. But I know a lot of people who have, and it's an aberration that I've witnessed at close quarters and that I've wondered about quite a lot.
It seemed to be almost the nightmares that could grow out of rock and roll getting out of hand.
Well, it's also about the kind of aberration that I've already discussed slightly in terms of stadiums, for instance, and those kind of numbers of people and the power that you get, the kind of mind-numbing power that you can wield in a thing like that. If you get a big enough PA, it's almost as if it's a kind of sadomasochistic thing where the audience want to be hurt in some more strange way, because they know there are going to be 2,000 or 3,000 drunken people there who are likely to throw bottles at them, or I don't know what it is, but they're strange situations, and they, the mindlessness of the response reminded me of those old Lenny Riefenstahl movies of Triumph of the Will and things like that, Nuremberg rallies and things. And there's something unsettlingly parallel about the two images.
With the depressing visions that the Wall movie offered, critics became disenchanted with Waters' preoccupation with doom and gloom. The disenchantment turned to distaste when he released The Final Cut, his reaction to Britain's part in the Falklands War. As honest an effort as The Final Cut was, critics passed it off as just an extension of material from The Wall. Those are now kind words compared to reviews he's received for his new album, Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. The press has attacked his dream-influenced imagery savagely, saying that his work is just so much neurotic wailing.
I take myself more seriously than they think somebody in rock and roll ought to be allowed to. So they don't want to allow me to, we're, in rock and roll, we are not allowed the breadth of expression that you are if you write books, for instance. If you write books, you can be Enid Blyton or Harold Robbins or Kurt Vonnegut, or Thomas Mann, or anyone you like, and that's okay because it's accepted that, these things can be very disparate and it doesn't all have to be the same. But a lot of journalists particularly get very kind of possessive about the words rock and roll. It's got to be like this, If it's not Bruce Springsteen, it's no good. Do you know what I mean? What I'm trying to say, I think people's attitudes to rock and roll, they think that they're involved in a big, free, liberal, nice thing, but in fact they're extremely conservative. And they don't like people who are mucking around on the periphery of what they consider is, something that they own, really. Maybe. Or maybe not. Maybe it is just so much neurotic wailing.